Good morning, everybody. I really hope that your week has been going well. As cheesy as this is about to be, going off the title, I really hope you hear what I say in this video. Because hearing is such a huge part of what we need to do as our lives, or in our lives as Christians. We need to hear what is being said to us. When we hear what God is saying, then we gain a sense of direction. To be honest, I don't have everything figured out in life, but in fact, I'm most of the time very clueless as to what's going on. So when I get direction from God, it's very important to me because without it, I become lost. And personally, as a man, there's no worse feeling than being lost. I mean, why do you think that us guys have such a hard time stopping and asking for directions whenever we get lost? It's a kind of a shot to our pride whenever we have to do anything like that. But like in the life of a Christian, pride easily gets in the way of what we need to hear. It becomes a horrible cycle. Once we begin to hear what we need to do, then we begin to see God's careful planning. I think I covered that in, I don't know, maybe the last 3 videos I've done. But one of the most important ways for us to hear is to stop speaking. A pastor recently at my church, Pastor James Jones, said it very well. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that way we can do twice as much hearing instead of speaking. That's very, very wise words, and that will be something I carry with me for a very long time. It's so very easy for us to speak impulsively when instead we should really listen rationally. So, first verse that I've got, and I've got to say, I got this Bible today. This is the biggest Bible I have ever seen. It's got extra large print, and I love it. But made sure I went ahead and got some of the notes. Verses marked out. First verse is James 1:19 and 20. It says, "So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." God does not give us wisdom like this for just any reason. He gives us wisdom like this so that we become more like Christ and we can begin to walk into a closer relationship with Him, or to even begin or start to do what He wants us to do. The last thing you ever really want to do is to go against what God is trying to do or argue what God is trying to tell us to do. Moses tried to tell God that he was unable. Moses was unable. And God didn't budge on what God already knew. I mean, Moses was speaking complete nonsense at this point. I mean, seriously, the great I Am has just told you what you're supposed to do, and your response is, surely there's somebody better. Hopefully we don't see pride excuse me. Right here, we don't necessarily see pride get in the way of what Moses needed to hear. Rather, instead, we see something else get in the way of what Moses needed to do, and that is fear. Fear got in his way. Fear of his past, fear of his current abilities, and regardless of what God had just said. Now, what is God telling you to do that you are afraid of? I remember when I felt like I needed to start doing these videos, and I was petrified. If you go back and you look at the first video, my eyes are about this big. I was scared to death, and there was nobody in the room. But I think I said something about it in the video, because I hear a lot of Christians say that they need to be bold for God, but they never really do anything about it, because they end up becoming too afraid to do what they feel like God is calling them to do. And one thing that I do need to state is boldness begins by stepping out in faith. Stepping out in faith means that God knows what you need, and having trust in Him that He will be able to provide the tools that you need. If you can't choose, God will supply your wisdom. If you can't walk, God will supply your healing. If you can't see, God will supply your sight. And like Moses, if you can't speak, God will provide you with an Aaron. With every can't that you give God, He will counter that and give you a supply for whatever your situation is. Don't try and tell God what you think you know. Instead, hear what God already has seen. Hear what God is saying. Ignore what the devil tells you, because all he has to do is nothing that we really need to hear anyways. The negativity, the lies, the hate, the selfishness, it's nothing that we need. It's beneath us. It literally is beneath us. But everything he says can be very, very difficult to kind of filter out when all those emotions just begin to scream at you. Instead, we need to hear God through His Word and through prayer. Those can be valuable assets or tools throughout any of the battles that we face. In Matthew 11 and 15, it says, "He who has ears, let him hear." I kind of feel like Yoda saying this, but we must train ourselves to hear. Yes, Star Wars reference. Had to put it in there. But we need to train ourselves to hear because God does not always speak in an expecting voice. We say the voice of God and we think of this loud, thundering, sky splitting voice that's just, it rocks heaven and earth, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it can be much, much more different than that. If you go back to 1 Kings 19, and we'll start in verse 9. I want to read 2 verses. First, "And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your own prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." This is Elijah running, fearful, even though he knew of the great power God was capable of doing, and yet he was still afraid. Now, check out what God does to get his attention in the next 2 verses. 11. "Then he said, Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice." Not a strong wind, not an earthquake, not a fire. A still small voice. After this, God gives Elijah the pep talk that he needed, and he sent him out to his next assignment. On to what God had planned next. I find myself constantly looking for the big thunder of a voice to tell me what to do sometimes, and I totally miss what God has right in front of me with that still small voice. It scares me to even think, honestly, to just sit down and think about how much I have missed because I was trying to hear the thunder voice instead of the still small voice. It really doesn't take any formal training to try and hear the small voice. It just takes a shift of focus and a little bit of patience, like a nudge on your heart pointing you where you need to go. I know that life can get busy, and it can be very difficult for us to still ourselves and hear that still small voice. But when you take the time for God and what he can do in your life, it becomes worth it. Now, all that being said, and before I log off of this video, I just have one last question for you. Do you hear?